my panelists join us. You don't have to have slides or anything. Just your brains, your mouths, I guess.
You don't know what you're asking for.
Yep. So this is the session, How Can Learning Analytics Contribute to a Wider Notion of Student Success? And who we have with us today is an esteemed panel. I'm not sure I like the word senior. Do you like the word senior? I would say esteemed panelists who represent institutions and are decision makers at their institutions for how learning analytics is used and what the ways it can improve things on their campus from their perspective. And so my job today is mostly just to seed some questions and let them talk to you about what's going on in their institutions. We have, in order down at the far end, is Belinda Tynan, who's at RMIT. And she, as you can see from your reading along with me, she's the Education and Vice President there. Next to her is Dragan Gazovic, who's at Monash. And then we have Professor Pip Patterson, who's the DVC of Education at the University of Sydney in Australia, and Shirley Alexander, who is the DVC and Vice President of Education and Students at the University of Technology in Sydney. So missing is my colleague from Michigan, Tim McKay, who is kind of my partner in crime at Michigan for a lot of learning analytics things. Unfortunately, his wife slipped on the ice because it's still very much winter in Michigan. She broke her ankle in 4 places and had to have surgery. So we said, yeah, Tim, you shouldn't come to Australia. Stay home with your wife. So, but nevertheless, we have 4 panelists, and I'm sure we will enjoy some conversation with them. So getting us off and started, I think we first need just a basic round robin for you each to have, tell us a little bit about what initiatives are happening on your campus to change how we measure and support student success. That's kind of vague, so you can answer it in however you want. And why don't we go ahead and start with you, Belinda?
Oh, why not?
Why not?
I'll go first. Is this on? Can people hear?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Hello, everyone. It's really nice to see some really familiar faces here as well and sort of catching up with some people I haven't seen in a long time. So it's great to be here in Sydney, and it's fantastic to have the opportunity to be on this panel as well. So some of you might have met me previously at another LAK conference where I spoke about what I was doing at the Open University. And I know there are some people here from the UK, from the OU as well, and it's lovely to see my colleagues there. But I was very chuffed to find out yesterday, just in a lift from someone, who they said that, I said, how's it going? How's analytics going? And they said, oh, it's mainstreamed. I thought, way to go. That is so fantastic to hear that. It's sort of an interesting journey for me, because coming back to Australia and having been back here for 18 months now, you know, one of the first things I did at RMIT was to say, right, well, what's going on with learning analytics and analytics just sort of generally? What's our framework and how are we going to think about this for an institution? And because I've been quite passionate about it myself, it sort of becomes a bit of my baby too. And being a senior leader in the organisation, that's great for the analytics team, because it gives them sort of a new rationale and a mission in terms of what I'd like to achieve within the organisation using data and how data can inform our decisions that we make as senior leaders, and certainly in how we resource in particular. But that's not just the only reason. I also care very passionately for the experience that our students have. Not just the experience they have in their classroom, but the experience they have from when they first sort of touch us as a university right through to when they graduate from us. And in my role, that's basically what I look after, where students first touch us right through to when they graduate and everything that happens in between. It's a very exciting role to have, but it comes with huge responsibility and accountability for you know, an amazing, fantastic student experience, and to help support our graduates reach their aspirations so that they can you know, cope within a world that I think increasingly becomes more complex. They need to be more adaptive, as another of my colleagues has said. So within the context of RMIT, like most organisations, I arrive and you find that data is sitting all around the organisation in different places. There are territories to be had, places which you can't go because people don't want you to go there. There's an IT department that, looks after all the technology and, doesn't have it necessarily as a priority either, trying to explain what you need. Then you have other people who are sort of trying to own how data is used and interpreted within the organisation. Even the quality of the data then, starts to be disputed. So actually getting a sense of, well, where's the single source of truth and does such a thing even exist? Are all the typical things. And then, you have a whole sort of layering through the organisation of where and how data is used and for what purpose as well, and not really having that aligned to a mission or a strategic direction. So what we've tried to do at RMIT is to sort of say, well, what is the strategic direction here? Where are we going? What do we want data for? What questions do we actually want answered? And for me, it always comes back to having a really good question, because in the end, it doesn't really matter where the data is or who's got it or whose territory it sits in. It's really about, for me, well, what question am I trying to answer here? When I was at the OU, one of the big questions was really around retention and attrition. Whereas RMIT, the question's a little different, because actually our attrition and retention, it's really good. We sit very high in the Australian market for that. So the kind of questions that we're asking are really sitting around, well, how inspiring are our teachers and how motivating is the context which our students sit within, and do the services that we have that wrap around our students actually support them to reach their aspiration? So when you start to define what those questions are, you can then begin to say, well, what do we need to do differently here to reach those aspirations? So for me, about getting sort of my head around the context, it's probably no different to any other university that might be in this room, in a sense, about, what we're all dealing with. And I did see some nods before about, who owns the data, where does that sit, and who gets to control how it's used, etc. Then for me, it's about capturing people's imagination. And for some of you who have met some of my team, but Pablo is sitting in the back row there, we've been really talking about a metaphor that can sort of capture people's imaginations to tell the story of what it might mean. And our story really sits around a little Australian animal called a bandicoot. I don't know how many of you know bandicoots. They're very cute little creatures with long noses. They spend a lot of their time digging, they tunnel a lot, and they do a lot of dispersal. They are endemic in Australia. They are all about poking their noses beneath the surfaces. They do a lot of scratching, they dig deep tunnels, they're bulldozing tracks, and they're creating subterranean barrows. Now, when we start to talk about bandicoots and what they actually do, we can start to tell a story with our staff and with our organisation around what using data is all about and what we can be in that space as well. So if you want to know more about our bandicoots, I suggest you have a chat to Pablo about it. But it's about capturing people's imagination, and that's really, really important in terms of how we then frame what we're doing at RMIT. For me, in my role as a leader in the organisation, it's about whatever we do has to show benefit. It has to have a return on investment. It has to demonstrate impact. And so that's very important. It's very pragmatic, what we're doing. It's really about what can happen now, what is real time now in our classrooms and with our staff, and having those good questions that we're trying to answer. But, I guess if I was to say there's a single challenge in all of this, it's about bringing people together, because you're changing the culture of an organisation to view their world from a different or an alternative lens. Having a high-level champion actually helps that, because people will pay attention. But I think without a high-level champion, it can be quite difficult to get leverage, to get an organisational approach, and that's what we're trying to do at RMIT. And further demonstration of that is that, I have supported my staff to come here to this event. I see it as being important to be part of a community as well. So that's just a very quick snapshot of what we're trying to do at RMIT. We're just at the very beginning, but I think we're getting more and more people on the page. We've got fantastic sort of researchers network that's, sort of wraps around it, that is distributed across the university as well. But it's small steps. But I have to say, I'm captured by the bandicoot, and we're going to do a lot more nosing around and digging, and that will be our metaphor as we move forward. I
think we have a new mascot for Solar.
But I learned how to. I have learned from actually Simon. I said to him yesterday that I wanted to thank him that very early on we did a presentation which was all about his neighbour's fish tank. And the controlled conditions of the fish tank and all the kit you can buy where you can understand the quality of the water and the heat of the water and the plants and etc. Talking about learning analytics and analytics even at enterprise level by using a metaphor that sits around ecosystems is actually really powerful. Mm-hmm. So I thank Simon for that, and his influence is now also being felt in the work that we're trying to do at RMIT.
Great, thank you. Yeah, we'll just go on this intro part. Let's just go right down the line, Dragon.
All right, temporally and sequentially. All right, all right. So I just moved to Monash University only this is my 5th week. So I can't really say much about what we are doing at Monash, except that I'm scanning and I can talk about some of the existing initiatives and what strategic approach we are going to take. I'm going to tell you probably in about 6 months, maybe LAK'19 would be a ideal place. I just moved from the University of Edinburgh. I'm going to talk primarily what we did at the University of Edinburgh, what we are still doing. I'm still having a small affiliation with the University of Edinburgh. Luckily, my partner in crime in many of these initiatives is here in the audience, Anne-Marie Scott. So the University of Edinburgh is one of Russell Group's university in the UK, and in terms of student retention, 94%. So there's no really kind of any obvious kind of problem you want to fix. And so when I joined there, the University of Edinburgh was just basically having a really big focus on digital education and also lots of focus on data. So, and that basically proved to be kind of the critical strategic priority, not only for the University of Edinburgh, but also the entire city. So there was something which was announced a few months ago, and that's basically called City Deal. So the intention of the city of Edinburgh is to become the capital of data of Europe. And so that basically is kind of all that expertise lined up. But that's basically on the surface when you enter a new institution. Over time, you actually realize that there are plenty of different types of issues that are happening inside of the institution, but also you kind of get to appreciate the complexity of the institution that you are working with. One of the things that I actually now appreciate at Monash University is we have a single learning management system. At the University of Edinburgh, I think at the moment is still 7 or 9 different learning management systems. And Anne-Marie was actually very proud to point out that was down from 15 different learning management systems that the university at some point operated. And that kind of tells you an interesting story, how complex it is actually to even kind of bring different groups around the campus, how complex it is to kind of get data together from all these different pots of information. There's another thing. While the University of Edinburgh has a fair bit of reputation internationally for its research standing, when you go into something which is called National Student Survey, the University of Edinburgh is the bottom quartile together with UCL and the likes. And that's basically kind of primarily related to student satisfaction within the institution. The question is quite complex, and the question is not clearly understood for an institution as well. But there are certain priority areas for an institution. It's, for example, the quality of feedback, how we are providing that quality of feedback. Then there is another question for an institution is basically commitment to equity. But then the question is there are plenty of these different initiatives that are happening inside of the university and how we are doing those. There are also strategic priorities for the institutions, like, for example, growing a university, but then the university cannot really be grown anymore so much on campus. And the priority of the university is to get to 10,000 students by 2020. At the moment is about 3,500 fully online students. So those are some of these strategic priorities, and we are growing and getting that type of a growth, how to operate in such a context. And there's a final point that to be made to just kind of outline the environment in which we operate. It is basically the complexity and the different types of concerns related to privacy and ethics. In the UK, which is a bit more liberal on that level, and then in the rest of Europe, and especially considering that in Europe there's new legislation which is called GDPR, or General Data Protection Regulation, which will be enforced sometime mid-May. And so lots of questions, lots of doubts. So initially what we started to do there was to simply just kind of do a simple documentation, what we have in terms of learning analytics initiatives. Every school would do something. Well, Central Unit as well, they were doing things. So we want to kind of identify what are those institutional priority projects that are happening centrally, what are those that are happening across the campus. Also, what are those different types of priorities? What are those projects we are collaborating with many different institutions across Europe or internationally, and how we can, to a certain extent, also really better assess institutional capacity to understand how we can put together different pots of data. And we had one institutional project with an external consultant. It was basically our focus at that time just to focus on fully online courses, because it was kind of a contained project and help us to do some sort of stress testing. And then we got to appreciate how hard for us was to even get basically connections between our student records and learning management systems, and even which learning management systems. From that point on, we basically started actually realizing that we need to get a broader engagement of different stakeholders on campus. And that process, what we decided to do was to create a institutional policy, which would address many of these ethical and privacy-related issues, and at the same time also give some form of strategic guidance for the institution. We decided to have that policy development process in 2 phases. Phase 1 was that we wanted to design a policy which would be a simple 2-pager and which would be composed of general principles for learning analytics, and second component would be purposes, why we are doing learning analytics. And the second phase would be then that we would actually define all these dry details that also have lots of legal issues with respect to informed consent, with respect to access to data, with respect to data governance, and different types of informed decisions to be made. With respect to the development of this first part of the policy, what do we decide to do it? We actually decided to use it as a communication vehicle, really, to engage everybody on campus in terms of spreading the word about learning analytics, at the same time getting basically some traction as well for learning analytics. And part of that process, we actually, again, we were fortunate to go to almost all the schools at the University of Edinburgh, from basically arts to science to different maths department, and you name it. Lots of different perspectives. Lots of basically starting with a kind of basic document, and you actually get some surprising things. You would go to different types of social sciences schools, and would expect lots of concerns. On the other hand, it proved to be actually a very productive conversation, and you go to different types of sciences, and all of a sudden you get lots of pushback. And then you realize that people have different perspectives. You're talking about certain things that can be very useful with learning analytics that can be done at scale, and they are talking about classes with 10 or 15 students. And they don't see much value. And then over the course of that conversation, you realize that actually they have plenty of other classes that can benefit a lot from these type of problems. But it was extremely helpful for us to kind of go through this process just to kind of raise awareness for learning analytics, at the same time also get a fairly kind of collaboratively designed document about principles and purposes. Principle was actually designed in such a way that we would say, for example, that data is always incomplete, and no major decision about students would be made in an automated way, but rather it would be mostly kind of conversation starter. Also, we wanted to recognize that learning analytics would not promote any deficit models, but rather it would be basically a tool to promote unlocking a full potential of all the students. We also wanted to make sure to recognize that policy analytics can perpetuate bias, and we have plenty of evidence for that. So it would be precisely defined at a kind of the core of our policy. We also had to kind of recognize the importance of good governance and also issues of transparency. One thing, though, it was mostly also a political thing as well, that we had to acknowledge inside of that policy through different groups, etc., is that learning analytics cannot be used for academic performance assessment. And that was basically incorporated, although in some of our groups, we actually got a bit of pushback. Academics said, why not? I'll leave it to you to actually ask which group of academics really love to be always ranked and etc. Anyways, so there was a bit of a pushback. And then on the more kind of fun part of the process, in terms of kind of purposes of learning analytics, I'm going to stop at that point and continue maybe some other place, is the top priority was quality. How can we enhance the quality of experience for learners, quality of our learning designs, at the same time while we are talking when we are coping with scale and provide personalized feedback. Those were some of the critical priorities, along, for example, use the learning analytics for assessment of the existing and future initiatives that are aiming to reduce any kind of inequity gaps across the campus, as well as for measurement of the effectiveness and efficiency of some of the newly introduced initiatives.
Great, thank you, Dragan. Pip,
Thank you.
Tell us about your place.
Yes, so 15, I'm impressed. I've only found 12 learning management systems at the University of Sydney. That's great, you win. And I must say your policy is fabulous. We were just looking at that a few weeks ago. I think it's a really good piece of work. So we developed in 2016 a new strategic plan for the University of Sydney, and analytics features in that plan. It does so in quite an exploratory way, and I'll explain that a bit more in a moment. We very much see the role of analytics as potentially something that will allow us to provide better feedback to students and to staff so that the learning process can be enhanced in some way. And that's really the sort of line that we're taking. We're very much, as I said, at an exploratory stage. We're encouraging staff, and we've got lots of fabulous staff who are very interested in learning analytics. Abelardo is here, of course, Catherine, Danny Liu, Adam Bridgman, lots of people who've been quite active in the field have been engaged in various kinds of initiatives, and we're very supportive of those, and we provide often, not always, some grant funding to support the development of ideas. And I think it's probably fair to say that we've got a range of more or less mature kind of initiatives underway. Abelardo's got a very interesting one that he might talk about. The student relationship engagement system that you might have heard of that Danny Liu's helped to develop, that grew organically across the campus without any intervention centrally, and there's now hundreds of units of study use that. It's a system which sort of brings data together and actually allows staff to make decisions about communications with students or things they might do in the classroom on the basis of compilations of the data. So it's a convenient tool for staff. There's no complicated analysis behind it, but it's just a very nice tool for bringing everything together a staff member might need and actually take action in a way that's sort of quite responsive to the particular context or pattern of outcomes and engagement for particular students. And both students and staff give us wonderful feedback on that. So if I see anything sort of being rolled out with a more central sort of institutional frame at this stage, it's probably something of that kind, so, because it has the feature that everyone knows what's going on, everyone understands the data, and it's in the hands of staff who, after all, are the ones who we want to be designing the learning activities and actually taking as much account as they can of where each individual student is up to in understanding what's going on with respect to the material in the class. Having said that, we've also got some central funding to actually support learning analytics initiatives more generally. And one of the very first things we did was actually go through the exercise that Dragon just described of trying to identify the principles for the use of student data and the approach to analytics that we would take. And we completed that work early on. The more difficult part of the work was actually trying to identify all the university systems on which we should put notices to students, alerting them to the presence of those principles. I think Catherine is now the only person in the university who knows most about where all the systems are, but it's actually quite a difficult task, and I think both of the earlier speakers have spoken to the issue of the complexity of university systems, the different kinds of systems you have for the same task, the different ways in which they all interact with one another. It really is quite a difficult and complex environment. So large-scale institutional things are, a bridge too far for us at the moment. But the other initiative I'd there's two more that I'll just mention briefly. One is the creation of what we're calling an educational data bank, which is, in other words, centrally going through the task of bringing together various potentially interesting sources of data. And actually, in order to provide a research facility, it's really a research data bank for investigators within the university to actually get access to data and do something interesting and see whether they can find something interesting that might be worth looking at or developing further. And so that's really just getting underway this year, but we do think that's quite an interesting way of trying to make better use of our data, trying to understand what there might be of interest in it to different parts of the learning analytics community, wherever they are in the university, and there's certainly some in different pockets. But as yet, I can't say that we've seen any, great new insights from that. But I think it's a good, interesting approach to take, and a relatively inexpensive one. The other thing we've done is experiment with, machine learning approaches at a more institutional level. I have to say that's been a little disappointing to date, partly because of data issues, and partly because, well, for all of the reasons that have already been well canvassed in the first session about, the difficulty of black box solutions. Nonetheless, I think we're still at the stage where our minds are very open about the value that learning analytics might bring to the various sort of institutional issues we have, and we are keen to explore further. So, I think that's it for me. The one final thing I'd say is that it's always been my hypothesis, I suppose, that learning analytics will be at its most useful when, as part of the data stream to which we're applying some analytic capacity, contains within it well understood diagnostic markers of conceptual understanding of some sort. And one of the institutional projects that we're undertaking as part of our broader strategic plan is the development of rubrics and a measurement model for actually assessing the sort of graduate qualities that we hope our students graduate with. And there will be, at various points, and especially towards the end of their study, an assessment that is framed in terms of common rubrics with respect to performance. And that, I think, will be, one of the interesting ways in which we'll be able to undertake some analysis at a much broader level than individual units of study that is potentially interesting. I'll stop there.
Great, thank you. Shirley?
So I might start out just by answering one part of the question, which is what initiatives are happening on campus to change how we support student success. So about 5 years ago, I embarked on what some people call a career-ending initiative, potentially career-ending initiative. Because my university, which is probably the closest to here, it's about 10 minutes walk, was embarking on a $1.5 billion project to enhance its campus and have a whole new development of its campus. So what was uppermost in my mind was, how do we make sure that we're building a campus for the future of learning rather than the past of learning? And so I came up, and it was around the time when MOOCs were coming out, and our governing council got very worried that we were about to be overtaken by MOOCs. And in what was then called another career-ending recommendation, I advised them I didn't think they would take over campuses, and that's proved to be correct at the moment. But really trying to look at if students can do a course online for free, why would they want to pay and come onto campus? And so we looked at all the evidence from lots and lots of research over decades about how students learn best and how we can ensure them that they have the greatest success that we can possibly provide. And we came up with a strategy that I originally made a mistake in naming, because I included a year, and I didn't think beyond that year. But now it's called Learning.Futures. and it's a particular approach to learning, and which involves working with other people, working on real life problems, authentic activities, authentic assessment, and so on. And so as part of that, in building our new buildings, we did not build a single standard lecture theatre. Instead, every space is collaborative, so that when students make the decision to come onto campus, they're actually actively engaged in doing things. It's not to say you can't do that in lecture theatres, but it's much harder. So we've put a major investment in trying to ensure our students' success by redesigning learning and redesigning the whole campus. And so the way that analytics comes into that is also about 5 years ago. I embarked on a project that I called the Data Intensive University, which was really saying if only we knew what we actually know. So it comes back to the keynote this morning. We are drowning in data at the moment, and A, we don't use it well enough to really understand what's going on in our campus, and B, a lot of people, even when given summaries of data, don't know how to interpret it. And so we have embarked on a project to make sure that both our staff and our students who are living in a data-rich world actually really understand what that data is telling them. And this is one of my favourite stories, and so apologies if you've heard it before, but we once had an education minister who gave a press conference and announced that she was appalled to find that half the students in New South Wales are below average in mathematics. And so someone had to explain to her that that's what an average is, half are below and half are above, in general, normal distribution and so on, qualifiers. But if we have people at such a senior level who are making major decisions who don't even understand what an average is, then we're in real trouble. So we have to make sure that people understand what they're looking at. And I can't tell you, I'm a lapsed statistician, although people say I should drop saying lapsed, but I can't tell you how many meetings I sit in and we look at a graph of something going down or up, and they say the sky's falling in, we have to devote millions of dollars to doing something, and I have to try and explain it's random variation. And by looking at the numbers, it's not significant. This is just a random fluctuation that's happened by chance, not because the sky is falling in. So if we're going to be living in a rich world, a data-rich world, we have to be sure that people really understand what they're looking at. So then, just going back to some of the basic things within our Learning Future strategy, a part of that is that we want every student to have an internship during their degree, and if for reasons, there's a whole variety of reasons, carer responsibilities, disabilities and so on, they can't undertake an internship. They should undertake an internship-like experience. And so one of the outcomes of our data-intensive university project was to set up a separate unit that would look at how we can use the data that we have in our university to do a better job of what we do, so that we can know what we know. And that unit is headed by Simon Buckingham-Shum. And so one of the projects they've been doing for us is looking at data on students who do have internships. So it's not completely rolled out yet, but they've produced, if anyone ever needed convincing about the value of internships, they've been able to show in different faculties the impact of what some people say is student success, which is that they get a job at the end of their degree. If they've undertaken an internship or internship-like experience, they're often 50% more likely to get a job than those who have never undertaken an internship. And we're looking at data on that. One of the things that I do, it takes me several weekends a year as I sit down and read through all the qualitative comments that students make in a whole raft of student surveys. And over, one of the major complaints has been around assessment. And in particular, not getting enough feedback on assessment. And I'm sure you've all seen Simon and Andrew and I forget who else is here, project on writing analytics, how we can use analytics to give students automated feedback on their writing that they can go through multiple iterations until they are ready to submit it to a human being for marking. So we're using that unit to really measure what we're doing and to improve upon it. So that's a short answer of my career-ending project.
Wow, thank you. Well, I think many of you are probably sitting there thinking, I wish I had leadership at my institution with the vision that is represented by these our speakers here today. Because I think in my experience in talking to people, most often the question I get asked about the learning analytics we're doing at Michigan is, how can you do that, right? And it's a combination of technical and legal and social. I mean, because the university really is an ecosystem, and there are certainly great variations between universities, but the notion of student success is ultimately one that all institutions have to justify or face. And I think you've mentioned some of your goals for that. I loved Dragon's comment about we have no obvious problem to fix. Now, how many of your faculty members, when offered the chance to get some analytics on their teaching, would feel there's no obvious problem to fix, right? Yeah, so my question is to you each, or those of you who, we don't have to go round robin for everything, but how do you get faculty buy-in? So you guys are setting strategic priorities for the university. You're using data for sort of evidence-based decision making. How do you, and there is, I understand there's a great variation within across institutions, across countries about the autonomy of faculty members, but nevertheless, it end up in their classroom. So can you talk about some of your experiences sort of getting these things enacted at the classroom level?
So perhaps I'll go first this time. I think, there absolutely has to be something in it for academics. And because we've been involved in this for some time, we've had the opportunity to experience both successes and failures. And I'll talk about a failure first, which was quite a number of years ago. We decided that our students would really benefit from having a dashboard that they could look at their own behaviour. So we gave them a graph of their engagements with the university, because you often see research that shows, and it's probably a no-brainer, that the more engaged students are with their learning, the higher their quality of learning is going to be and the better their grades. So we thought we'd give them a graph to show them the number of engagements they had, and then they could also press a button and see what students who get distinctions, what kind of engagement level they have. The students were happy for us to use the data as long as we could guarantee that the academics couldn't see it. The academics desperately wanted to see it and said that even if you could give us a summary of what's happening, that would be really terrific. But the student steering group declined and said no. So we got a lot of buy-out from academics then, because they couldn't get access to it. Only students could. But some of the other tools that we're using are of great benefit to academics. We've got one who's being supported by Simon's team, who has a large class of 600, and he is able to send out a personalised email every week to students, which is a nice narrative about, this is what your week has been, you've done this, you did well in this quiz, you haven't really looked at this resource, and I would suggest that you do that in order to improve your understanding of that. And the students think that this academic is sending them a personal email. They're very impressed with the personalised service. But those kinds of opportunities for academics to get really good engagement with students really helps in acceptance, I think.
Good. So some useful examples that really touch them where they live.
Yeah, if I could, just picking up on Shirley's example, the SRES case I mentioned, if staff see other staff using it and liking it and getting value from it, that's a powerful motivator, peer influence. But the other thing, of course, that I think academics respond really well to is evidence and good argument. And so that's why I always love to start with sort of opt-in models where staff can use it, test it, improve it, and actually gather the evidence that then can be used to persuade others who are a little bit more uncertain.
One of my former students and colleagues in the LAK community, Andy Crum, has reminded me when we use the term data-driven decision-making, data doesn't actually drive decisions, people do, right? So I think there's a confluence of what you said about giving them evidence, but also back to Shirley's point about you can give people evidence and they can't necessarily interpret it, right? And so I think, I think there's really interesting issues mixed up in some of these things. Dragan or Belinda, did you want?
Really brief. I mean, just basically,
Yes.
they made all the great points. Just kind of in the terms of the approach that we use in Edinburgh to kind of go to that point, to kind of reach to raising that kind of point of acceptance, potential acceptances. Initially, everybody was fairly kind of consistently against it. The major argument was workload, and workload.
Yeah.
And that was basically what we were getting from our faculty members in Edinburgh. But then this exercise of the development of policy and engagement with different groups across the campus rose a lot of awareness, right? And we actually sparked a lot of interest also among different people. The second point we did then was to organize a number of different kind of training opportunities for them, different types of workshops. Opportunities also to show them some real value of the tools, like for example, this collaboration we have with Abelardo Pardo, and the development of the tool he's leading on-task personalized feedback. And I think we are all talking about kind of similar type of approach. And there's a very clear value proposition. It's also a very precise problem that is almost a pain point for every university, every faculty member wants to do it. And I think that's the kind of right way, great point to start it. Once you get faculty members to engage data at that level, then things will actually go by themselves, I think.
One of the discussions I was having yesterday was a lot of times when you ask faculty what they want, the things that they're responding to are things that will make their jobs more efficient and not necessarily innovate the way that they teach. So can you, any of you, and Belinda?
Yeah, just on that previous point, I was
go ahead.
picking up on what some of the others were saying. There's something about having a burning platform or a purpose, and having that sort of clearly defined, I think helps sort of focus the mind. And I think in the two examples, in the context that I've worked, having a single question, which if you're leading it from an organisational perspective that you're trying to answer, really helps garner people around something, because otherwise it can become very diluted in terms of what you're trying to do, and you can have many examples and many experiments happening, but none of that may actually be solving any of the problem that you actually have. So there's something in that I think has helped me in terms of the two contexts that I've worked in this space. And then I think the other thing is that the PD piece, the professional development, is incredibly important. And it's not just about the academics. So we're talking about faculty members, but actually in the environments that I'm working in, it's actually teams of people, and it's program managers, it's course coordinators, it's resource managers, it's a whole range of different people who are gathering around data to understand what it is and how they can impact it. So I think it probably, if we're thinking about it as in that organisational design way, it's about teams of people who are trying to answer problems. It's not just the domain of the academic.
Yeah, I think that's a lovely point, and I didn't mean to imply that it wasn't part of a larger system. I'm very impressed in the efforts that some of your institutions are making to do it very broadly across the different stakeholders in the communities. So that's lovely. We have a lot of good brain power sitting up here, and you've heard now some summaries of some of the things that are going on. I want to make sure we don't run out of time for, I have more questions, but I bet you do too. So let's open this up and make it a little more interactive. Questions, points, comments? There's one starting in the back there.
Thank you, everyone. A question for Shirley. I'm a proud UTS alumni, and I got a lot out of my 2 internships. How does UTS dance around the tension between being a data-intensive university and at the same time a university that is very committed to internships where I assume, maybe wrongly, that students go out into industry and you have less visibility about what's going on. So how do you collect data while they're away, but also how do you justify doing things that are educationally very good, even though you might not have a lot of data from that?
That's a really good question. One of the really good programs that has been developed in an organic way at UTS is a program called Review. I don't know how many people have ever heard of it. Anyone heard of it? Yeah, so it was a project of one of our academics at UTS, Darryl Thompson, which is really about self and academic assessment of graduate attributes. And so for every assignment that a student undertakes, they do a self-assessment by using a sliding scale, and then the academic does the same thing about their achievement of communication skills or something. And then there's something written about it as well. And I'm hoping that that's going to be able to be used a lot more for students going out on internships. There's been a lot of focus on what students are actually doing on internships, because there's pretty much no point, or there's very little point or little to be gained for students if they go out to do an internship and they're fetching coffee and doing photocopying. All they really get to see is what a terrible workplace culture is. And so by having an agreement between the university and the employer on exactly what the student will be doing and how they'll be getting feedback. The feedback is what is the really critical thing in an internship. And then being able to use a tool like Review to document that is probably the best answer to your question about what we're doing.
Yep. Someone over here?
I think this man here, Peter.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your feedback and information. My question's for Dragon, and particularly coming into a new institution. You've had quite a lot of experience from Edinburgh. I guess the question is, what have you learnt that you will not do at Monash? And maybe
It's a
others
nice question.
could perhaps come in afterwards and perhaps have some insights as well.
That's a great question. The question of basically what I would not do is quite difficult one, simply because I'm already coming to Monash. It's a quite different institution, right? And so many things that I would try to do in Edinburgh would not be anyways applicable, right? So for example, the first thing that I came to Monash, I can see that I can easily get access and data that is connected across the campus, and the complexity of the situation is much, I'd say, simpler. One thing that I probably would try to do would be more proactively to actually sooner start engagement with different faculty members than we did, for example, in Edinburgh. So rather me basically going through all this process and trying to have some of these pilots, I'd rather actually immediately start with some of these professional development activities, because we are anyways now much better positioned. We have many of these tools and technologies, and also there's a clear value proposition made, right? At the time when I started, which was not really a long time ago, but it was basically 3.5 years ago, in Edinburgh, we didn't have so many of these tools, and even just getting out there and trying to show some of these things would be still a level of predictive modeling, and it would be a bit risky. The other thing that we basically also tried in Edinburgh, I don't think I would do it now at Monash, simply because we learned our lesson anyways. In Edinburgh, is basically we have this pilot, which was very beneficial for Edinburgh to work with an external consultant to basically implement it, try to basically link our student record data and learning management system, and also try to engage different faculty members. But we anyways almost knew that pilot would never turn into kind of an institutional project, right? So it was helpful at the University of Edinburgh to kind of help us stress test, but I don't think I would do that again at Monash, simply because the lesson was learned, and also the type of the analytics that they are providing is not necessarily suited. And when you go out there and look at many of these external service providers, most of them are really offering retention-focused solutions. And if that's the kind of solution that an institution needs, that's fine. But even then, I'd say that many of these existing solutions are so dashboard focused, and they are really kind of stereotypes of what Shirley made a point of, that our faculty members in Edinburgh really couldn't make sense out of it. I basically had to bring also a team of my PhD students who have background in machine learning and statistics to make interpretations of some of the features that were identified as predictive, right? And so that's basically something for us. But there's, I think, even a broader challenge for us is not many universities can really develop their own technology. And wherever I enter an institution, they say, oh, we are developing this institutional dashboard. Do we all need to do that work? And is there really kind of great value for it? But then the second thing is that many of that work can really be done in collaboration with some external organizations and providers of these types of services. The question is, how can we get to the point that we get the type of information and insight that can inform decisions, rather than we are buying pretty charts?
I know we have one question up in the top, but I want to, people often want to hear from people who are invested in these things. Are there other things that you would tell people, don't do it? Just don't do it. And Dragon mentions one that I say often from my perspective at Michigan is never sign a contract with a vendor that doesn't let you own your own data at the level in which you need it. Do you have other gems, little like just takeaway messages for
From my perspective, having worked in two contexts, what I've done differently in this context is not to create a special project. And so this is about working, there's a phrase for it, outward in or inward out. So inward out. So instead of setting up a special group over here who does this, rather there is a group that already kind of does this. So let's reorient the resource that we currently have to focus in a new way. And so even branding it. So rather than having a surveys group, it's an analytics group. And so it's about changing a language and a discourse which influences the organisation from within outwards in a different way. Whereas at the OU we set up a different group to try and spearhead it through, which still worked. But then when you have to then embed it within the business, whereas I think starting from within, embedding it in the business from day one, means the change process is less violent.
I was just going to say, because we've made quite a big investment in analytics at my institution, that means that I'm always held to account for how that money is being spent and what value are we getting out of it. So my advice is to be very targeted about what projects you engage in. There's so much fascinating data out there about a whole range of things that it would be easy to run off on a tangent, what I would call a tangent, but others wouldn't. But at the end of the day, you have to sit down and say, this is the value add that making this investment has in the university. So it absolutely has to be aligned to institutional priorities.
Well, and you also have to accept the risk that it may show.
That's right. You have to be prepared that it'll show things that you thought were working really well, in fact, aren't. And that the investment in those things is not worth it either.
Yeah, thank you. You've been very patient up there. You're kind of in my spotlight, but it's okay. We got you. What's your question for us?
I'm a data analyst in a secondary school, high school, and one of the things I work with is trying to maximise our students' ATAR score in the Australian context, or results when they leave Year 12. Just wondering if there's any data or ongoing research around what the students come into university with, especially the younger students, the 18, 19-year-olds, with regard to ATAR or other qualifications, and their relative success in the university course.
Yes.
There's lots on this.
Right.
Lots.
No, I was just going to say yes. I think most universities spend quite a lot of time trying to understand performance patterns and things like the ATAR, of course, are an important piece of background information about the sort of level of achievement that a student brings to the university, and it's important to include it in analyses, even if you don't want to understand it particularly. It's important. It's just an important piece of information.
And for our global people, ATAR is like matriculation, so it's going from school into university or college, and it's a score which enables universities to select students.
But also to answer your question, yes, we spend a lot of time looking at the pathways that our students come into our university from and what their success rate is like. We do a lot of that, and you'll be pleased to know that one of the really successful pathways is the school's recommendation scheme. When the school recommends to us not to worry too much about the ATAR, about this student, because there's a whole story around them, but they'll do well, they almost always do. I remember one particular case some years ago where the principal told us this student is one of 8 children living in a 1-bedroom apartment. The culture of her family is that she has to serve the needs of the males in the family before she can study, and the only place she has to study is on the stairs, the stairwell of her block of apartments. She still managed to get an ATAR, but not anywhere near the course that she was wanting to do. So we let her in and she did really well. So that's a main learning.
Great. We're almost out of time, but we probably have time for one more question back here. Yes. Thank you.
I absolutely hear what you're talking about in terms of investment and the need for it to be able to make the case that it is very well aligned with strategic priorities and so forth. But you knew there was a but. One of the things that I find when I think about, and this is to refer back a little bit to a comment David made toward the end of his talk about degrees of granularity, right? And what seems really relevant in the moment, say to the teacher, saying, right, what I need for this specific student at this particular moment versus the pattern at large. Something like that, although it's not a perfect analogy, I see happening at the organizational level, right? In terms of what happens at leadership and what's happening with faculty. And improving teaching, improving instructional practice takes time. And so the investment and frequently efficacy dips in the first several months after people start applying things. And that can include the use of data in new ways that they hadn't considered before. Could you talk a little bit about how to successfully negotiate those competing demands in terms of how that works out across time, right? Wanting to move the needle very quickly when actually changing the culture around teaching requires that people figure out what they can do in the time that it takes to do it well.
Nice, thank you.
Well, just a quick word. I think a lot of it is about expectation setting and actually understanding ourselves about the sort of nature of the social process that has to sit around the change that you're implementing, and understanding that that is actually going to take time, and ensuring that the governing body understands that that might take time. So I just think we need to be very sensible and measured in our expectations and how we communicate them.
Linda, I think you're going to get the final word.
Yeah, and it's a little bit off-piste actually, because
okay.
I won't be here tomorrow, and tomorrow's International Women's Day. And I just wanted to say it's such an honour to be amongst so many senior women, and especially on this panel today. And I see tomorrow you have a female keynote speaker as well. And also to all the women that are now in the room and attending this conference and participating at times in a field which is heavily data-driven and doesn't necessarily have the pull-through of women. So I think I'm really proud to see all of you here. I'm proud to be with these senior women. It's fantastic that we have a female president.
Thank you.
Of Solar as well. And I hope tomorrow that you do celebrate the fact of the fantastic women that are here in this community, and we have a special spotlight on them.
That is a lovely final thought, and I just want to encourage the women who are here to ask questions, because one of the things I like to do at meetings is keep score. And in our session today, we had 3 men and 1 woman ask a question, even though we have a panel of 3 women and 1 man, right? So, you know, be empowered. Your ideas are important. Your questions are important. They're not less intelligent than anyone else's. So feel free to be a fully active part of this community in any way that you're comfortable with, but maybe also get a little out of your comfort zone, because we are the kind of community that I think that is accepting and want to be that kind of inclusive community. So thank you for joining us today. Thank you for our speakers, and get lunch. We're between you and lunch, which is just out where the food has been. So thank you.